Welcome to the lecture, Structure of Gender and Age in Society. This is for the Sociology of Women and Aging, and my name is Tamara Smith. I am the professor for this class. So I wanted to start today, and really the semester's class, of talking about some of the assumptions that we go in from a sociological understanding of gender and age. When we look at gender, one of the things that we have to consider is how people are born and how they're developed. Essentially, sociology is the study of that. From birth or earlier, we know that people's gendered expectations influence how we treat boys and girls. And in an intro sociology class, we focus mostly on that childhood socialization. But when we're looking at older women and how older women may have been socialized to behave in a certain way because of their gender, we really have to consider the time period in which they were raised. We know that today parents might select pink clothes and dolls for baby girls, sports clothing, and brighter colors for boys. There are a lot of students who I have who've claimed no, their parents were actually pretty gender neutral when it came to the ways that they raised them. Okay, maybe that's true, but for someone who was born in 1940, the gender norms of that historical time were very, very heavily dictated by society and by the availability of different clothing options. So, just to be clear, from a sociological perspective, when we talk about sex, male, female, intersex, we're really talking about a biological identity. In this case, when we're talking about older women, we're talking about their gender. We're not saying older females. Older females would be indicative of talking about biological identity. But gender is the socially learned expectations and behaviors associated with members of each sex. So when we look at how older women are taught to behave in our society, the role of the other older woman and how she has been conditioned to behave in certain ways changes over time within our society. And we have many generations and many different cohorts alive at any one time. So, what was socially appropriate for socializing children at one age might not be socially appropriate for another age. So, for example, it used to be very socially appropriate that when a young toddler was in trouble, that hitting them was expected. And over time, we've seen that really become out of fashion within parenting models. So I bring these types of things up because when we're looking at an older woman population, we really have to not only pay attention to what their roles are as women and what their roles are as older people in our society, but also how those two roles intersect to form the social role of the older woman. When we look at gender socialization in our society, we know that gender socialization is the act of learning the expectations of how to behave as a boy or a girl, and this begins in infancy. Some of the agents of gender socialization, and what I mean by that is some of the people and institutions that actually do the act of socializing others, include a family. Someone's parents or parental figures or guardians have a lot to do with how a child is socialized into gender norms. This is further given more socialization by a child's peers. Even if a family at home is doing everything they can to not create a very gendered experience for their child, children do it to each other. They do it with their peers, and they certainly do it in the types of play that they have. We know that a lot of toys, excuse me, that are gender specific really enact some of these differences. So boys' toys tend to be very loud, more likely to be able to be played outside, more likely to be very movable and active. Girls' toys tend to be more passive, easily played inside, and the script for little girls' plays in these scenarios, sorry about that, is really being more of a cooperative player. And these types of socialization patterns, they have effects within our society. Outside of the family, socialization continues throughout a person's life. We know that schools are a way of enforcing gender socialization. The simple act of having a class walk down the hallway in a line of boys and girls are plenty of cues given to socialization patterns. When we look at how different religions treat gender and how the mass media treats gender as two more examples, we see that the average person is hit with so many different media messages and socialization messages on how to act appropriately that we really look at this as lifelong socialization. Gender socialization is reinforced whenever gender-linked behaviors receive approval or disapproval from all of these multiple influences. So, if you have a young girl who is sitting in a seat and her legs are not together, she may be encouraged or discouraged from that behavior by her parents. She may be encouraged or discouraged by the children around her. Her teachers may have something to say about how she's sitting. Her religious entity may have a statement to make about how she's sitting. And certainly the mass media has a lot to say about different characteristics and how we pose ourselves. All of this, from a sociological perspective, brings us into socialization. When we look at gendered institutions within our society, these are the patterned behaviors that we see consistently throughout our society. We see many social institutions that are patterned. We see stereotypical expectations of what we expect women versus men to do. We also see gender socialization playing out in interpersonal relationships. What is the role of a boyfriend? What is the role of a girlfriend? And why do we use the heteronormative relationship as the base pattern for relationships? All of this can be linked back to socialization within our society. We can look at the different placement of men and women in the institutions within our society. What does a woman do within the family? What is a woman's role within the workplace? What is a woman's role when it comes to parenting? All of these issues are issues that the older woman within our society has been socialized to accept or defy. We know that schools are gendered institutions because they're founded on specific gender patterns. If you look around Westfield State and even looking at majors, who's more likely to go into English majors versus business majors? We see many different gender patterns within schools. At the college level, we see those gender patterns playing out into whom you're assigned to live with and whether or not that's a matched gender. So gender is all in it. Gender happens at every level of society. For some sociologists, gender is the number one lens through which they view the world. For the sake of this course, I just want you to really consider the ways in which older women in our society from a very young age were socialized into how to appropriately behave as an older woman. Within our society, we have a lot of gender stratification. Now, gender stratification is the hierarchical distribution of social and economic resources according to gender. We know that older women, particularly single older women, are more likely to have fewer benefits in later life. We know they're more likely to be poor. We know they're less likely to have pensions. They're more likely to not be married if they had a divorce within their lives. And sociologists would refer to this as a gender stratification that occurs, where we see how social and economic resources are really distributed differently among men and women. And this is even amplified in older age. Keeping that in mind, you have to consider that for the women who are elderly in our society right now, they grew up during eras that had more gender apartheid than we see today. We used to see much more extreme segregation and exclusion of women from public life. Everything from allowing which jobs they were able to apply to whether or not women were allowed to work and be pregnant at the same time, to how much women were actually compensated for different jobs. These are not new types of concerns within our society. If you think about the difference between gender stratification and gender apartheid, in today's society, we definitely have gender stratification. We still have men making more money than women, and that's regardless of the different qualifiers to that. We can look at single women, single men, we can look at race, we can look at education, and even when every other factor comes into play, we still see that difference. But that's gender stratification. That's different from being completely removed and excluded from those realms. For older women today, the oldest old that are alive were born prior to a woman having the right to vote. And that's simply one of the many ways that women were excluded from public life. And these are women who today are the ways that we can see this come out is that many things that we take for granted today really were freedoms that were struggled for by earlier generations of women. I'm talking about things like access to birth control. This was a woman's social issue movement. I'm sorry, social movement issue. And having access to birth control has been something that has created much more inclusion for many women being able to take part in the public sphere. Another example includes access to divorce. Up until the 1970s, we did not have a no-fault divorce, so a woman had the onus of having to prove the reason why this marriage had to be dissolved. And in many cases, women had to make the decision to leave their children behind in order to escape a marriage because of the lack of access to divorce. And we're no longer in that realm. We also have seen a lot of equal opportunity legislation that has legally paved the way for women to be able to be more participatory in public life. But for the women who are elderly today, these are movements that they lived much of their lives without having these things that we now take for granted. We also are relatively new with any sort of laws against sexual harassment, any sort of laws regarding domestic violence. For many decades, women came of age during times when they did not have those freedoms down on paper. Today, because of Title IX, we see increased athletic opportunities for women. For women who are elderly, they were not allowed to be in sports that were dominated by men, for example. The notion that we have girls who are playing sports such as wrestling or hockey, at other historical times, that was considered completely radical. And now today, we're seeing more women in political life. I always find it interesting how Hillary Clinton was really propped up as one of the first women who, well, ran for president, so clearly that's historic in and of itself. But when we look at women and their exclusion from political life through the last century, it's no surprise that the first time we would have a woman running for the office of president would be an elderly woman. This simply is a testament to some of the struggles that we faced within the last decade of creating protections for women in the public sphere. Now, again, I bring this up not to bring it up from a political discourse center, but really to help you as a student understand that when we're looking at the role of older women in our society, it is impossible to only look at today as a cross section of society. We need to understand some of the struggles women have historically faced in order to situate their current realities. So let's give you an example, because the elephant in the room during this semester is the presidency and the election that just occurred. Now, according to the Pew Research Center, looking at exit polls after the election in 2014, so this is before Trump. But if we look at elections leading up to Trump's inauguration, what we see is that younger people, the 18 to 29-year-old bracket, tend to vote a lot more for Democrats than Republicans. And older people tend to vote a lot more heavily for Republicans than Democrats. That's not to say that every single person who's elderly is a Republican and that every single younger person is a Democrat. But it is saying we have some age issues going on here. And it may be that older people were coming of age during times of great civil unrest, and that may be their rationale for being Republicans or Democrats. Or it may be because they've seen more opportunities throughout their lifetime. Like, we don't know just on an educated guess as to why we see such a disparity between younger and older generations. But it's an important point to bring up to this class, because very often we're talking about a very marginalized group within our society, looking at older women. And sometimes the political views that they have are different from younger generations. We can refer to this, properly, it's been referred to as a generation gap in our society, that the values that older people hold don't necessarily correlate with values that younger people hold. And one of the struggles that I'll have for this semester is trying not to overstate any sort of political views for younger people or older people. I'm aware that, as with every person within the country, you have all had the right to vote for who you want to have in office during this political election, as have older women. And I'm not trying to talk about the validity of any person's choices, but we will talk about the consequence of elections in this class. It's important to look at current events and how they shape the role of older women in our society at all times, even if it's a political discourse that sometimes makes people feel uncomfortable. So when we have times within our society where older women are targeted as populations that have a lot of change coming to them, very often we'll tend to focus on older women as a social problem in and of itself. So, for example, here are two quotes, and these are from the 80s because I was trying to keep it historically situated. But one quote: "Women live longer than men. They are usually poorer than men, and because their husbands die earlier, they are more likely to live alone and, in extreme old age, be institutionalized." Or another one: "Women are given the dubious privilege of living longer than men. After years of financial and psychological dependency, they are ill prepared to survive on their own, much less use their added years with enjoyment and fulfillment." Now, these are really inflammatory comments. They certainly paint an image of the older woman as needing help and not being adept at helping herself. And in sociology, we really refer to this as a social problem perspective. But the problem is that when you apply a social problems perspective to a group of people, not an issue, but to a person, that becomes very alienating for the older person. It has a direct impact on the amount of ageism that we have in society. And therefore, this notion of only looking at the issue of older women through a social problems lens or perspective, I really feel that that's limiting for the purpose of our courses. I really want to also focus on some of the strides and successes of women and what some of the joys of being an older woman is. I think that's a lot more effective as a teaching tool than only looking at it from a social problems perspective. So in this course, like I said, we'll be talking about older women. But even if we look at the term old woman, what are we talking about? Well, we've had so much change within recent years, and people are living so much longer that we're starting to have more and more definitions breaking down categories of old age as a way to try to deal with these changing demographics and the changing face of who is the older woman in our society. I'll touch upon these later throughout the course. We know that women live longer than men. And when we look at the last US Census and life expectancy at birth, we see that there's a discrepancy. Oh, didn't mean to go so fast there, sorry. But that brings us to the point where we really want to look at a life course framework rather than only looking at women as older women in society. The life course framework is a different approach. This framework emphasizes the interaction of historical events, individual decisions, opportunities, and the effects of early life outcomes in determining later life outcomes. If you were born in poverty, then as an adult, if you are not in poverty, you may have had very different struggles from childhood to now. And to not include any of that, not include, for example, the recession of 2008, when we look at the current situation of older women, we would really be limiting the amount of information that we have in which to paint this picture. The life course framework allows us to look at the entire frame of age to say, okay, right now, many of you are in your early 20s. Have you thought about how your decision to go to college is going to affect you when you're an older person, when you're 65 years old, when you're 85 years old? Very often, we tend to only focus on the age in which we are, and we don't do much long-term planning or long-term thoughts about how things will change as we move through the life